have had an introduction to the Dasam Granth? Does anybody want to give me a quick one-liner about what it is? Or what's the main scripture? It's lively. Right. Adi Granth, or the Guru Granth Sahib, super influential. There's another text that's also influential, probably the second most influential text there is. It's called the Dasam Granth, and it's attributed to Guru Gobind Singh. So it used to be extremely influential, and it still continues to be really influential today. And I'll draw that out. So if you're going to ask how it was influential or how it is influential now, during the initiation ceremonies of the Khalsa, so the Amrit Sanchar, there's 5 prayers that are recited. And 3 out of the 5 come from the Dasam Granth. So in that ceremony, actually the minority of prayers are from the Adi Granth, or the Guru Granth Sahib. So even today, it's really influential. Previously, in the 18th and 19th century, it was also very influential. It used to be, and we have photos of this, we have written accounts of this, placed alongside the Guru Granth Sahib, or the Adi Granth. So in a Sikh temple now, you'll go inside and there'll be the Guru Granth Sahib there. But traditionally, actually, we have accounts of this, it was placed alongside the Guru Granth Sahib. And actually, you have 18th century literature that talks about how the Dasam Granth can be thought of as like the younger brother of the Guru Granth Sahib, but sharing in a similar light, I guess. But however, when looking at it, it appears extremely different than the Guru Granth Sahib. So this has caused a lot of confusion as to maybe who the author was. And actually, in regard to that, I'm not going to be discussing authorship or the controversy over it. But if you do want to look at that, Robin Reinhardt has a really good book on that called Debating the Dasam Granth. So actually, just to bring us back to that context of when it was influential, when it was created, just a quick question. What does Singh mean?
Singh is the last name of, well, it's used as a last name for men in the Sikh community.
Right, correct. But what does it literally mean? Lion, right? Lion, some people think tiger. When did people get that name? Like, when did that become prominent in the community? Right, during that first Khalsa initiation ceremony. That was 1699, right? And what did that ceremony consist of? It was like, there was a bowl, they were stirring the amrit, the water with the sugar in it, and there's prayers being recited, but it was stirred with a sword, a double-edged sword, a khanda. Also during that time, you had the 10th Guru making commands that those, and we have written accounts of this, you have those that come into the court, my presence, the Guru is saying, they should be armed. They should be wearing weapons, and any donations at that time were going to be made with weapons instead of the usual. So all of which to say, that time, as you guys have looked at the history of that time, it was extremely martial. There was a political and social engagement during that time that was, well, you can talk about it as having like a martial atmosphere. And that's where the Dasam Granth kind of comes out of. And actually, the Dasam Granth, when you look at it, it makes sense when you look at it through that context. Like the text resembles the context of its origin. And actually what I want to do is, in looking at the Dasam Granth, I want to look at the context, and then through that look at the Dasam Granth. And then when you look at the Dasam Granth, you'll be able to look into the context of that time as well. So they both go back and forth. So yeah, this is a more contemporary photo of the court of Guru Gobind Singh. As you can see, flanked by warriors, there's weapons, there's cannons in the background. There's an elephant there that was donated by a local hill Raja. On the top left, you can see. We have all written accounts about that. So anyways, in talking about the context, one example about this courtly, martial atmosphere that seeps into the Dasam Granth is the language, right? You're going to ask, what's the Dasam Granth written in? It's a language called Braj Pasha. Now, Braj Pasha, it has its origins around the time of Akbar. Akbar is in the middle, and there's a Braj poet on the far right. So during that time of Akbar, Braj Pasha, this language was just kind of like a classical Hindi. It's not exactly. Like if you know modern day Hindi, it's not going to really give you proficiency in it. But what it is it took in words from Persian, words from Sanskrit. It was kind of like this old school Hindi where you could amalgamate all these different words into it. So poets loved it because it gave them versatility. Anyways, but prior to Akbar, it was used in devotional literature by Bhakti writers, usually in the area of Braj. And that area would usually write in Vaishnava terms or in praise of Krishna. But when it became used, this language in the courts, like political courts, like Akbar, they kind of took Braj and they used it in other genres. So they would use it in historical writings, secular writings, martial writings, and a favorite of theirs was blending all of these all together. So you'd have the historical, you'd have contemporary people written into like these mythological accounts. And that's actually what you see in the Dasam Granth as well. So that's kind of the backdrop of the language. One genre in particular that the Dasam Granth uses is, it's called raso poetry. Raso is like, it can mean martial poetry. And much of the Dasam Granth is in this type of meter and this type of flavor. And actually, there's different types of Braj literature as well, is what I wanted to get to. There's Prabandha compositions and standalone compositions. So Prabandha compositions are those that are like multiple pieces all linked together with a narrative, with a theme. And those are generally thought as really high craft poetry. And this is what the Dasam Granth is, because it's a compilation of all these different stories. So for an example, a natak or a drama would be considered a Prabandha composition. Same with a charita, which is like a storytelling. So the Dasam Granth has both of these. In fact, the two largest compositions in the Dasam Granth are these like compilations of all these different stories of avtaras, as well as stories about deceit, the Chritopakyan. So anyways, the Prabandha compositions, they were known for their complex meters that it would take. They would use a lot of dance figuration as well in there. So that speaks to kind of the poetics that we're going to get to that as well. So anyways, all of which that to say, when you look at the Dasam Granth and its Prabandha framework, it's very different than Guru Granth Sahib, Adi Granth. So when you look at the Adi Granth, you're going to look at it and put it beside Dasam Granth, it's going to look completely different. Because you guys have read a little bit of literature from the Adi Granth. It's usually, it is categorized by raga. So it'll start off, Siddhi Rag is the first rag, then subsequent rags after. Any composition written, for example, in Siddhi Rag would be in that section of it, so you know where to go in it. It's organized by rags. This is quite different than Dasam Granth. Actually, other reasons, like if you were to look at the Adi Granth now, any of the writings of the gurus, they all have placeholders for the name of Nanak in there as well. So even if you look at the second guru, or the third guru, the fourth guru, fifth, they all, in their passages, they'll write Nanak says, and this is a tradition actually in Bhakti literature as well. In the Guru Granth Sahib, you have writings of Sheikh Farid, but it's actually not the original 12th century Sheikh Farid, say some scholars. They say that the language indicates that it was a contemporary of Guru Nanak, 15th century. So in that tradition, just like in the Sikh tradition and other Bhakti traditions, whoever was sitting on the throne of that community would write the originator's name in there. So for example, that 15th century, I believe his name was Sheikh Ibrahim, he would write Farid in that writing as well. Just like the second, third, and fourth gurus, fifth gurus, ninth guru wrote Nanak in there. That was a Bhakti tradition. It was kind of like a style that they adopted. But this in Braj is completely different because the poets really like to be lyrical gymnasts in a way that they could write their name in multiple pen names so that it would fit into the meter. So the Dasam Granth follows along the lines of other, they call it Riti literature or Braj literature, where one poet will have multiple names. Sorry, I should have shown this before as well. These are just an old miniature of some Bhakti poets. You have Kabir there, you have Namdev. Both are in Guru Granth Sahib. So to actually explore Dasam Granth properly and the language properly, you have to go into the aesthetics, because that brings out the essence about what Dasam Granth is. So the way Braj literature was formed, the way the poets would write, it followed along the lines of Sanskrit literary theory. So in Sanskrit literary theory, you had this notion about rasa, or emotions. And traditionally, there would be 8 emotions that poets would try to speak to. And this got expanded when Bhakti literature came in. But originally there was 8, and they would structure it such that the poetics and the meter and the flavor all brought out certain cues and protocols to like drive an emotion home. For example, like if they were trying to do laughter, they would have certain cues and emotions for laughter. They wanted to make somebody terrified, they would have that. If they wanted to make somebody kind of pumped up in like this heroic type of spirit, they would have that as well. And is that like heroic spirit, that virasa, that's what Dasam Granth generally falls towards. And you can tell this by the meter and some of the poetic language in there as well. We'll be drawing that out. But to understand kind of the culture at that time, the people in a court who would be listening to Braj would be kind of connoisseurs to that art. Like I was saying before, this is kind of like a high craft of poets. This was not like the Guru Granth Sahib could be called, Shackle talks about this term, Sadhu Pasha, or the language of the sadhus, Sant Pasha, the language of the saints. This was kind of generally well known during Bhakti communities, such that it wasn't like a complicated language. It was basically the language of the people. It's quite different from traditional Indian sources which were written in Sanskrit that required, if anybody's taken Sanskrit here, it requires a lot of study to understand what's going on. So that was in the language of the people. Braj was kind of an in-between. So you had these connoisseurs that could pick up on like the cues, I guess, and the protocols about what emotion they're trying to drive through. And this may seem like super foreign to you guys if I'm talking about Braj or ancient poetry, but like people do this today. If you think about like maybe a hockey game or like a basketball game, right? When they play that like that we will rock you, everybody claps at a certain point, everybody gets pumped up at a certain point. Like those are the type of cues they would have in Braj literature to kind of drive out some of these emotions about like getting pumped up maybe for battle, or getting pumped up, or maybe just laughing or getting scared. There's all different type of emotions that you can arouse. So this is just an example of a miniature pothi or Granth, the Bhagavad Puran. Actually, in the Dasam Granth, we have a Braj version of the Sanskrit ancient literature, and this is one of them. I'm working on the Ramayana, and those 2 compositions make up the majority of Dasam Granth. I didn't do the transliteration for this, so for those who can read it, that would be good. But if you can't, I'll draw this out for you. This is just an example. This particular meter is called Bhujang Prayat meter, and what it's trying to do is it's trying to evoke a certain emotion about the kind of the hustle and bustle of an army moving, and it does this in a few ways. I'll just read it out for you. So. Read here. The line goes, Kagardan Kati Katari Karakan, Tagardan Tiran Topakan Tarakan, Jagardan Nagardan Bagardan Baje, Jagardan Gaji Mahagaja Gaje. So there's a lot of things happening here. In the first line, if you can't read it, all the letters start with a K sound, ka. So that, you call that alliteration. And then, and you have that in the second line as well. And then you also have something called assonances. So assonances are, in every word of the sentence, there's a specific vowel there that creates a rhythm when you say it. So in this, you see the first word has gagardang, is long A. The second word, gati, another long A. Gatari, another long A. Garakang, another long A. So it creates that rhythm of like something moving, like maybe horses moving, or maybe the people running in a certain manner or formation. Then you have also onomatopoeia, which is basically the word sounds like what it's describing. So here it says, Katari karakang means like the katars, the daggers are hitting each other and making this noise like karak, karak. And then the second line says, Tupakang tarakang, like the guns are going off, going bam, bam. It's like that type of idea. So this is just one example. This verse is from the Chandi Charita, so the stories about the goddess Durga. And that's just kind of retelling some of these ancient Sanskrit tales in a way to pump up warriors. But there's also, what also I found interesting about the Dasam Granth was that even in the spiritual parts of the poetry, they still adopt these martial meters, which is quite different than Bhakti literature. So this is from the second composition of Dasam Granth called the Akalasat, which is the praise of the timeless or the deathless. So this one is in Tortak meter. And Tortak meter is said to kind of bring up the imagery of a gallop, like a horse galloping, because it goes like do-do, 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 do-do. Because if you read it, it'd be Je Portak Taram Sabe Tajahe, Ekachit Kripa Nidako Pajahe, Teoya Pavsagar Ko Tarahe, Pavapul Nande, Panor Tarahe. So it gives that to-do, it gives that like emotion. And you can see, like, if you look at the translation, this, you could paste this anywhere in a Bhakti type of literature, and it'd be like, yeah, this is super spiritual, this is not martial. And that's what makes the Dasam Granth so interesting, because even in the spiritual components of it, it has this really like, martial flavor to it. And actually I didn't, because I was running short on time, I didn't want to go through all of the compositions, but since you guys have like a brief understanding about the Dasam Granth, we can kind of draw that out in some of the questions. So I can end here kind of showing kind of the flavor that Dasam Granth tries to exude, kind of this martial, very like warlike type of flavor, heroic essence, they would call it. But, and then we can just have a Q&A if anybody has questions about the Dasam Granth.
Open up the floor for questions. I can start with one. I'll just get us started. What's sort of what have scholars said about why does the Dasam Granth use, if it's supposed to be sort of altered or patronized by the 10th Guru, why does it contain so many Hindu deities? Or sort of like, what is the, it's an interesting question that I've raised.
Yeah, I mean, that's $1 million question with the Dasam Granth, as well as like the controversy over it as well, right? Like, you're going to talk about today colonialism, and where ideas about identity become to the forefront in our community. So, for example, when people look at the Dasam Granth nowadays, like I pulled up, this is an old folio of Dasam Granth, and you can see at the top there, it has this image of the goddess on there as well, right? And today that would make people seem very uncomfortable, right? But, you know, you have 3 sections within the Dasam Granth that are talking about the goddess. And many authors, scholars have their different theories about why, you know, there was this material. And some people think, and Reinhardt draws this out as well, if you guys, you know, want to read that book. If anybody has an interest, that book is the best to read. Some people think that in rewriting these old tales, the Guru was kind of making a call to action. So, and this is actually my research on the Ramayana, is that there's a retelling of the Ramayana in the Dasam Granth, but it's not the same as the original, right? So then if it's not the same, what is it saying different, right? And initially when I was looking at it, it's like 40 to 50% of the verses are all describing battles. And if you look at the original, it's not that at all, right? And there's not really, the play in it is not about praising a specific person within those compositions. So for example, earlier on in the Bichitra Natak, a composition that comes before, you have passages that talk about, there were many Rams, there were many Krishnas, there were many goddesses, they all come and they go, right? So they kind of put that into context that, these things can maybe give you inspiration, but maybe they're not things to be worshipped, deities to be worshipped. So when you look at Dasam Granth on a whole, you can kind of get a better context as to why they do have those portions in it. Another way to think about it is like a strategy as well. Let's say if you look at maybe what Guru Gobind Singh was doing at that time, he was trying to coalesce people to fight under one banner. So for example, if you had half of this class were people who worship Krishna, and then you have in your court these tales being told about Krishna, being sung, you're authoring it, or maybe you're having a commission, but your way of framing that is, hey look, Krishna fought against what was wrong. And if you guys think you're worshippers of Krishna, should you guys not do the same? There's that explanation on it as well, that this was a way of coalescing all these different groups and kind of restating their message through other people's ideologies. It could be viewed in numerous ways, but it is something that a lot of people nowadays, especially, and which started during the colonialism period, had trouble stomaching when they started looking at this stuff. Yeah.
Why do you think they chose Braj Bhasha during that time? Like, why not stick with the Punjabi language?
Right. The courtly atmosphere of it is probably one of the main reasons. So for example, Braj Bhasha was extremely versatile and it had a lot of currency. So for example, these types of poems were being sung not only in the Guru's court, but in local, surrounding Rajput kingdoms, as well as in Aurangzeb's court, and as well as the previous king's courts. For example, you have writings, I think they're lower 1800s, that talk about why Guru Gobind Singh wrote in Braj and why he translated some of the Sanskrit texts into Braj, was that the feeling there was about accessibility, that normal people were being taken advantage of because you had pundits and you had people saying, for example, this Sanskrit text says this, therefore you should do this. And the people at the bottom were like, okay, I must say that, right? But they didn't have the chance even to read the original because, the learning process to access that was not possible for them. So this way, it was providing like a retelling of, they would say, okay, you want to read something about Rama? Here, this is our version of it. You can read it here. Or Krishna, or about the goddess. You can all read these things here. So people think about accessibility. They think about who they're pitching to, the audience. Those are some reasons. As well as the versatility of Braj. It allows you to use Persian words as well. Whereas Sanskrit and some of the Sadhu Pasha was not as versatile in bringing out certain emotions. The versatility in Braj Pasha, it's a very complicated language, but it's a very beautiful language as well. So those are some ideas about it. Nothing else?
I was wondering if you want to give a synopsis of the Dasam Granth version of the Ramayana? Do we have some differences, or that's it?
I'll just, one of the big, I've not started my thesis on that yet, but when I was originally looking at it, some striking things were the original Sanskrit, the Ramayana, the Valmiki Ramayana, doesn't focus on the battles that Rama takes. And that's something that's like extensively drawn out in the Ramavatar, the version in the Dasam Granth. So those things are like, for me, most notable. Also at the end of the Ramavatar, you have lines saying things like, I'm writing, the author is saying, I'm writing this not to put forward if Rama is a deity or he's a bad person, but I'm just writing this kind of to aspire kind of that heroic spirit. So there's a little bit of a contextualization at the end of it, a little bit of like a disclaimer, being like, yeah, don't take this as, you know, I'm really like a worshiper of Ram, that type of thing. So you have those lines in there which people kind of ignore on account of some of the imagery is too powerful for them to kind of take it into context. Yeah.
So right now, as you mentioned, that there is a lot of controversy about this as well.
Yeah.
Are there accounts for like about earlier Sikhs who were sort of like against these writings or had questions about it?
Yeah. Reinhardt talks about this in her book. I think the earliest mention is by Gansing Nabha, who is like 1920s. He writes about this. He talks about this. He says something like, at some point, and this is late, right? And this is after this colonialism has occurred, and he's on one side of the argument that has problems with the Dasam Granth. So he's writing this. And he says, basically, there was a point where half of the Dasam Granth was agreeable, and half of it, people thought, we shouldn't put this in here. And then, you know, through some deliberation, they decided to put it all together. That's a short story of it. But it's not until about the 1920s that you start to see actual writings that kind of criticize it. And before that, you have, I think, much of the 18th and 19th century makes it quite clear that it was held in a really high status. Yeah?
Similar to the past question, was there any like concepts or writings within the Dasam Granth that were controversial to what we accept as Sikhism now, like the religious concepts we have?
For sure, yeah. I think so. I think probably the biggest, there's probably two big ones. And both require like an extensive explanation, to which I can't really go into right now. But, so the biggest ones would be, for example, this, a lot of praise about the goddess, as well as there's a whole portion, actually it's the majority of the Dasam Granth, that are these like, there's about 404 stories that talk about deceit. It's called the Charitopakhyan. And they're like little sub-stories. And they're taken from Mahabharata, they're taken from Punjabi folklore, like you'll have Hir Ranja's story being told in Dasam Granth, which people find interesting. Other like folk stories being told in there as well. And those portions, I would say, kind of bring out the most controversy because they're quite detailed in illustrating the relationships between men and women in terms of being graphic. So many people who translate the Dasam Granth today actually leave that portion out because they say the Guru could not have written something so graphically, they think vulgar. But you should read Reinhardt's book on the Dasam Granth. She talks about it. And there are upcoming translations that are going to go into that. The translations available right now are not, they're not good. They're done by people who openly are like against it, so they kind of flavor it in that sense. But I would say those are the two things. And if you want to learn more about contextualizing this idea about the goddess in the Dasam Granth, Hardeep Singh Sian wrote a book, Militancy in the 17th Century, something like that. I think it'll be in your textbook, it'll be referenced in there. That book does a wonderful job about quoting old sources as well as his take on how the Guru used this idea about Shaktiism as a material change to basically get the people moving towards fighting against injustice, Ataram. And how that relates to practices about weapon worship, which is also written about in the old texts. And you see it, I mean, to this day, if you go to any takat, any of the major gurdwaras in India, there's a reason why they have some of the weapons laid out there, and sometimes even at a higher status than the Guru. If you go to Anandpur Sahib, if you go to Hazur Sahib, if you go to Patna Sahib, those are major takats, they all have that. So I think those two elements are probably the most controversial. I don't know, yeah.
One more question. So if you mentioned the stories are portrayed differently, are the characters portrayed differently as well? Like Ram, for instance, is he portrayed more of, I don't know, like a king than a god?
Right. That is something like scholars today are like, that's kind of unexamined. And that's why I'm actually in this master's, to learn Sanskrit, to go back to the original, to kind of draw out the differences between them, because nobody's done that. I mean, Reinhardt talks about how there's a big gap in scholarship about those type of questions, because some of those chapters are so toxic to people that they kind of just don't engage with them. They're just like, if this is about Ram, I don't want to have to deal with it because I'm sick, and that's not important to me. And that's really kind of the sentiment of what's going on. So yeah, the scholarship is lacking there. And, yeah. There's a 4th century Sanskrit translator who was translating Sanskrit into Japanese. I think you may be able to talk about this. He said any type of translation is like eating rice and then like taking it out and trying to feed it to someone else. It's just, you do lose, like any poetry, you lose the flavor. Like when we're talking about some of the cues and protocols about like Braj poetry, or even in Guru Granth Sahib, like Sadhu Pasha poetry, you know, we're not going to know that, right? Unless you study it in depth and you get a sense about what these, you know, certain things, because they're writing with like a really high sophistication level, and we're just trying to read the English. We're not getting the flavor out of it for sure. So there is that, and like, you're not going to get the flavor. But did that answer your question? I think. And translations are lacking on a whole, because a lot of the translations done are done by people, as we know, like the older generation in our community are not that proficient with English, so that when we read them, we're like, what does this mean? Like, we don't know. It's like, that's a problem as well. And in fact, honestly, there's a professor in England, Jasjit Singh, telling me about how the Guru Granth Sahib, their translations are just, he found out actually how they were being done, and like the modern translations of Guru Granth Sahib itself are like horrifically inaccurate. So that's also like a problem in our scholarship as well. Yeah.
Question, to take it, maybe it's a bit of a question, but could you just sort of gesture towards, what is the sort of debate about the authorship of Dasam Granth, in terms of sort of, you pointed out sort of why people think it's made on it, but sort of, is there any ideas about who may have written it, or is it composed for it? And because in sort of reading the science class, it sort of talks about the Natak,
Vijayatha Natak, yeah.
right, and has an autobiographical flavor. So we can just sort of talk about that.
Yeah, people, I mean, Reinhardt really draws us out. Her whole book's about that question, about why people think it was written by Guru Gobind Singh, whether people thought it was commissioned, whether people think it came much after that time. A lot of these, I think a lot of what's plagued the scholarship are not even really scholastic issues. And Reinhardt explicitly states that. It's these ideas about identity. It says ideas about what is in our community, what should not be in our community. That's actually really plagued it. And they use these, for example, some authors are like, oh, because there's multiple pen names in there, it couldn't have been Guru Gobind Singh. Why does he not state his own name? But these people have not read much of Braj other literature, in which poets will have multiple pen names. Or what they'll do is they'll look at the Dasam Granth through the lens of the Guru Granth Sahib, the Adi Granth, and be like, why is it not the same? If it's one of the gurus, it should be the same, right? But these are just their own presuppositions that they're imposing upon their research. It's just, I don't think it's very convincing. But I mean, on the other side, you have a lot of the literature from the 1700s, so the 18th century and the 19th century, which attribute it to Guru Gobind Singh, but they all have a little bit different stories about how it was compiled, when it was written. So those type of things people seize on to be like, see, if they're not 100% congruent, then let's dismiss it. So yeah, I think Reinhardt brings up good ideas about why some of the scholarship is plagued. And I don't know, I think because the literature is still so influential today, and it has been influential, like any talk about the Dasam Granth immediately gets targeted towards authorship, whereas, you know, that's kind of really not that relevant, because it is relevant and has been relevant, so let's have a intelligent conversation about what's in it. But people can't get by that barrier to get there. Yeah?
Wouldn't you say, though, it's kind of important to see like who written it, so you can see like certain like biases or like it's more understanding, like we'll get a better understanding based on the idea. Like I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
About what's important is inside as well, but well, I think in like.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and then it just becomes, you know, how much evidence do you require for you to take it as somebody's writing, right? And then you got to think, are we doing that same type of scholarship for the Adi Granth as well? You know, is there that same level of critical analysis on the authorship of the Adi Granth? And there's not, right? But you're right, there should be, and but it should be kept into context. I think most people agree that it comes from that time period, and you can tell that based on the literature, the style of the lyrics, the language being used, the type of meters, the type of flow. But people disagree on, you know, if he wrote it or if he didn't write it. And the thing is, I'm saying, try to get beyond just the it may appear that this is not Sikh literature. Go into the contents and you'll kind of see how maybe those presuppositions are incorrect. But yeah, it's useful.
For those, even on this question of authorship, even if it's not the actual guru who wrote it, it certainly seems to be authorized by his court.
Yeah, some
I
people.
think that much we can actually say about the text, right?
Right.
Even though we don't know whether the guru actually wrote this or whether his court poets wrote it,
Mhm.
it certainly seems to be a text that was authorized by.
Right. I mean, the thing is, like, you have texts not long after the guru left, which, you know, explicitly quotes the Dasam Granth extensively, right? So you have to wonder, like, if those people were so proficient with the Dasam Granth that they're quoting it offhand when talking about other historical sources, like, they must have been really well aware of it. And that's why looking at the history around the Dasam Granth can kind of draw that out. Who were the court poets in Guru Gobind Singh's court, right? Because the authors in the Dasam Granth, they don't have the same names as the court poets. The court poets have their own writings that are separate with their own names. So like that type of analysis is useful in drawing that out. But yeah, definitely it came from that time. That's what we know. Yeah.
I mean, at that time, the guru, he was pretty secular, and he wanted to include followers from all the religions, and there was no talk about, oh, well, you have to be Sikh to be a part of my court or be allowed to be in my court. So maybe this was just a way of embracing the idea of secularism.
Yeah, that's an argument put forward by a lot of scholars in that he's reaching out to different communities. So you have the Shakti community, which you have compositions from like the Chandi Divar, Chandi Charitar that can speak to them. You have Vaishnava community, the Chobi Saftar speaks to them. You have all these different communities that the guru is writing kind of to as an audience to. So, you know, you can kind of see this as the guru kind of reaching out to them as well. People have taken that type of stance on it as well. And the thing is, all of this seems very Hindu, but in the court as well, in Guru Gobind Singh's court, you had people like Nandlal Goya, who wrote many famous Persian ghazals. I don't know if you guys have looked at that, but yeah, you have Persian writings as well. You even have some Persian writings within the Dasam Granth. Like at the end of it, it's called the Hakayata. Those are in Persian. And the Zafarnama is included in there, which was the letter sent to the Emperor Aurangzeb. That's in Persian as well. And much of and this is why Buraj is used as well, because you can kind of use Persian language in there as well. So it's not just like Sanskrit-rooted words that are used in Dasam. There's quite a lot of Persian words in there as well. Even the title, like Badshahi, doesn't come from Sanskrit, it's Persian. But yeah, definitely there's that.
So please join me in thanking our wonderful guest lecturer today.